But before I start, there's one myth I wanted to bust up front, and I wanted to start by saying what I'm not going to be talking about today. And again, I don't know if it's the same here in South Africa, but in the UK, when people hear the word sales, they think about all sorts of negative things. And one stereotypical thing is buying a used car. And there are lots of really, really good used car salespeople and dealers out there, but certainly in the UK, there are some really bad ones too, that will try and sell you stuff you can't afford and do it in a very disingenuous way. And I wanted to start by reassuring you I'm absolutely not talking about that type of selling. I'm talking about creating conversations with our stakeholders to really show them the value so they don't even think twice about engaging VAs. They are lining up at our door, really wanting us to help them with their projects before they even know what projects they want to do. And we probably all agree as a community of BA professionals that we've got so much to value, so much to add, but I bet every single one of us has been in a situation where you've been thrown a solution. And the exec has made a decision that we're just buying X, and you're parachuted in, and you get what we call in the UK the JDI approach. JDI stands for just do it. And actually there's that wall of misunderstanding we need to break through. That's what I'm going to talk about today. And my presentation is in two main parts. I'm going to start by talking about why sales is so important, and I'm going to do that through a case study, through a bit of an analogy. And then I'm going to move on to talk about what we can do as analysts to sell what we do to our stakeholders. And I'm predominantly talking from an internal perspective here, so selling into our organisations. But if you are an external consultant, this will be useful as well. I'm going to talk about some techniques from the world of sales that I learned that have been useful, also some analysis techniques. It will be pretty fast going in that part of the presentation, but if you want to know more, just catch me afterwards or over coffee. So I'll start by talking about why sales is so important. And in order to do that, I want to transport you. So imagine now that we're in a different part of the world, and in fact a slightly different time. So I want you to imagine that it's 2004, and you're sitting in London, England. So I thought I'd get a bit of Britishness there. We're probably having a cup of tea. Or actually, knowing us Brits, probably a beer. Any time after midday is fair game for beer in the UK. And it turns out in 2004, the UK government was about to embark on a really major programme of change that would impact and affect the UK Fire and Rescue Service. At that time, in 2004, if you dialed 999, which is our emergency phone number, much like 911 or 112, and you reported a fire or you needed to be rescued, that call would be routed through to one of about 46 contact centres spread across the UK. And with the changing nature of threats to the UK in terms of severe weather events, where you might need lots of fire engines to attend, or even the increase in terrorism, where you might need to move fire engines around, there was a real concern because these 46 regional contact centres had sort of sprung up over a period of time. They'd evolved. The technology that they used were different. The processes were different, even to the point where there were some boundaries where if a fire truck crossed a boundary, the radio wouldn't work with the technology in the neighbouring region. So there was a real concern about resilience. So the UK launched the UK Fire Control Project. And what that aimed to do was rationalise from 46 contact centres to 9, to introduce interoperability between the equipment and to create a real smooth, slick process to defend, to defend against threats and fires and so on. Now fast forward from 2004. Now imagine you're sitting in the UK in London 2010, 6 years later. The project is cancelled. Okay, the project is cancelled after 6 years, and an inquiry is launched. And the inquiry concludes that after 6 years, the project hasn't achieved a single project objective. I mean, I'll just let you drink that in. That's quite an achievement, right, to run a project for 6 years and not achieve a single objective. I sense some of us have worked on some of those projects, right? It's how it happens sometimes. But it gets better, right, because the report concluded that the objectives that the project had were not suitable for the needs of the country anyway. So you had a project spending money for 6 years, not achieving a single objective, but it wouldn't have mattered if it had achieved the objectives because they were pointless anyway. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. The punchline, if we were to call it a punchline to this story, is the cost. The minimum, this is the estimated minimum spend, was £460 million. If my calculations are right, that's about 8.8 billion rand. To put that in context, that is enough to pay the salary of 1,500 firefighters for 10 years. Wasted. I would not like to be the project executive or the minister that has to explain away that anomaly on the balance sheet. And as you can imagine, in situations like this, there was outcry, quite rightly public outcry, and people were asking, well, how did rational, sensible people direct their dollars directly down the drain? Why did that happen? And the only reason I'm picking on this example, I mean, this happens the world over, it happens in private sector, public sector. This was a very public project failure, and all of the evidence was put in the public domain. And one thing you might or might not know about me is I'm a bit of a project geek. And I love researching project failures, and because all the evidence was there, I trawled through it. I mean, there were emails and all sorts. And I want to share with you some of the reasons that this project failed, or my interpretation of some of the reasons why this project failed. The first and most significant, and it's probably one we all come across, is there was no clear statement of problem. Different stakeholders were trying to use this project to solve different things. So for one stakeholder group, it was all about interoperability. It was about getting the tech to speak to the tech. It was almost seen as like a technology project. But another group was saying, well, yeah, it's kind of about that, but it's more about resilience. It's about creating a fit-for-purpose fire service that can respond to the needs of the United Kingdom in today's volatile, uncertain world. But one of the chief firefighting officers is quoted as saying, no, the primary focus here is firefighter safety. I want the guys and gals who are about to step into a fire having data on their screens, knowing what they're stepping into. Any one of those objectives, problems might have been fine. All of them might have been fine. But without that clarity of purpose, project is going to pull itself apart. Not only that, but there was early solutioneering. I mean, how often do we see that? It's like, when you read the documentation, the decision on the 9 contact centres, that was made really early. Some of the technical decisions were made really early. On top of that, there were key stakeholders that just weren't engaged early enough. I mean, I don't know about you, I've never worked with the fire, on a fire service project, but if I were, one group of stakeholders I would want to engage early would be firefighters. I mean, you would think, wouldn't you? But one piece of evidence that was presented during the project review suggested that average firefighters weren't involved for years in the project. So then you've lost the buy-in anyway. And finally, there was inadequate assessment of the current situation and data. In one of the oral sessions where one of the key project executives was being grilled by government ministers or civil servants, they were asked the question, well, why on earth would you want a system that's so big, so resilient, that it would enable you to send a fire engine from the south coast of the UK to the north? Would you ever actually do that? To which their response was, well, no, because by the time you got a fire engine from the south coast to the north coast, the fire would be out. I mean, not quite in those words, but also you would leave a huge vulnerability in the south. So what happened after this project was that they moved to a regional collaboration rather than a national one where regions would support each other. And they delivered, after the sunk cost of 460 billion, they delivered a cheaper solution for 80 billion. I mean, still a lot of money, but you know, which could have been delivered from the start. I would be being simplistic if I said these were the only reasons. Clearly there is a lot more. But I bet every one of us in our projects and organisations, I bet you've worked on projects where there's been no clear statement of problem. And I bet you've worked on projects where there's been early solutioning. And the question is, well, how can we get in there so these things don't happen? Because we really are indispensable. You know, we can stop these project problems, and so the question is, why are people not lining up to utilise our services, or why are they not always lining up to utilise our services? And I don't know about you, but when I see case studies like this, I have a common question that springs to my mind. And that is, where was the analysis? Because I mean, right, I know there are really talented BAs in UK government. I know some of them, they're awesome. And you sort of think, well, you wouldn't do a £460 million project without BAs. I mean, you wouldn't, would you? Would you? You guys are ahead of me. So there's this piece of legislation in the UK called the Freedom of Information Act. And you can request any piece of information the government holds, and if they hold it, they have to release it, unless it's an exemption, in which case they tell you that they hold it, but they can't release it. And I was so fascinated by this project failure that I asked for 2 pieces of information under the Freedom of Information Act. And I played what I like to call the FOI game. And the government department really didn't want to release this to me. They kept asking for clarifications, and every time they asked for a clarification, the clock starts again, so they get an extra 30 days. So I was playing this game for months, but I got there. I think tenacity is something we have as BAs. And the first question I asked was, well, please could you send me all the requirement artifacts? And I gave examples of what I meant, you know, requirement catalogs, use cases, whatever. Because, you know, if you're doing a £460 billion project, you're going to have a neat repository, aren't you, with traceability, and you're going to have it all linking up to business objectives and business requirements. I mean, you would, wouldn't you? You guys are ahead of me again. The response I got eventually was, there were no requirements held beyond the original business case. Now, I looked at that business case, and for what it's worth, it's pretty good for a business case, and it's got some high-level business, what we would call high-level business requirements in there. They're not implementable, though, and that's a scary thought. You know, if this is to believe, that's a scary thought. So the other question I asked was, well, can you send me details of the project team structure and how many BAs there were? And this really confused them. And we were toing and froing, and eventually they disclosed to me that there is no information held by the department that has any mention of business analysts being on that project. Now think about this, this is all documentation. If there had been a resource request or a Gantt chart, a plan with a role against it, they should have released it. So the implication, I mean, it's impossible to know for sure, right, because we're on the outside, we're looking in on this project. It's impossible to know for sure, but this would suggest that perhaps there weren't business analysts engaged. But contrast that with the fact that there are awesome, great BAs in UK government. And my theory, and this is just a theory, I have no idea whether this is true, my theory is there were probably some BAs sitting on the periphery of that project, banging on the door, saying, let me in, but maybe they weren't able to get in. And maybe there were other people doing the business analysis who weren't suited to it. So it's like a project failure, and it's like this brick wall of misunderstanding. Because I don't know about you, but as a BA, I sometimes think we've got all this cool stuff. You know, we've got models, and we can help you de-risk your projects, but our stakeholders don't see it. And sometimes they might see us as being bureaucrats, as slowing things down. That's not true, we know that. But it's like there's this brick wall of misunderstanding. And what we have to do as a community, and that's why conferences like this I think are awesome, is we need to, as a community, break down that brick wall of misunderstanding, brick by brick by brick by brick. And with each brick, we deliver more value, it becomes a virtuous cycle, and we can really show them how awesome, the awesome things we can do. And with that in mind, with this brick wall of misunderstanding, maybe sales isn't optional. Maybe we have to do it to get through this brick wall. And not only that, we increasingly as BAs live in a really, really complex environment. One question that's worth us all thinking about is, do our stakeholders have to use us? And if you're an internal BA, the answer is probably no. You know, they can probably go out and buy some licenses with software as a service under the radar. So if we can't prove our value, there's that danger that they're going to kind of do it anyway. And a technique, and you've probably seen this technique before, a great technique for looking at the competitive landscape is Porter's 5 forces. I mean, this is like traditional technique from notable economist Michael Porter. And he talked about how in an industry, it's worth thinking about not just the immediate competition, but also the bargaining power of your suppliers, of your buyers, the threat of new entrants, so people coming and stealing your lunch, and the threat of substitutes. So what could people use instead of you? So if you're a train company, they might use a plane or a boat or whatever. And we would traditionally use this for an industry or a domain. But you can start to sort of turn this slightly inward and say, well, who are we competing with as BAs? And have we ever thought about that? And the answer probably is we probably haven't thought about it as much as we could or should have. So you start to think about it, and you think about, okay, well, bargaining power of suppliers or bargaining power of buyers, do they have to engage us? And as we've said, the answer many times is no. You know, people might be able to find a way around us if they really want to. So making sure we've got that collaborative conversation, really understanding them so we can talk their language, selling the benefits to them is really key. But then there's the bargaining power of suppliers. And if you're in an internal BA function, I don't know if this is true, but I've certainly found this. If you're in an internal BA function, you might find that you've got a certain set of tools you have to use. You may not be able to access the requirements management tools you would ideally like to access because there's a corporate standard, and maybe you're stuck, or maybe the options you have are Word, Excel, Visio. And Word, Excel, Visio are fine, you know, they're good, but if one of our competitors is an external specialist, then maybe they've got other tools that they can rely on. If we're an internal BA, we might even have particular technology suppliers that we have to get a quote from, whereas if a customer were to go externally, they could get 3 quotes from whoever they wanted. So we might have that whole dynamic at play here. Then there's the question of the threat of new entrants, or what we might sometimes call land grab. Because if you think about it as business analysts, I mean, we sit at the intersection of so many different disciplines. It's one of the reasons I think it's such a cool, a really interesting discipline to be part of. But what about, for example, business architecture? You know, business architecture is great, but if you're a good senior BA, you're probably doing elements of architecture without even really thinking about it. You might even do elements of user experience. You know, if you've started to do prototyping, even low fidelity, there might be elements of user experience in there. And although traditionally this is seen as the threat of new entrants, a really interesting conversation to have is, how can we collaborate? How can we collaborate with business architects? How can we collaborate with user experience professionals? How can we work together to deliver an end-to-end service to our business? So this isn't just about competition, it's about that collaboration at those really interesting intersections as well. And then there's the threat of substitutes. And this is an interesting one. And it's going to depend on your organisation, but often substitutes might include external consultants. So some organisations will bring in external consultants rather than use their own internal BAs. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, sometimes that's a useful thing to do. But again, we can think about, how can we collaborate? How can we draw the knowledge out of the external consultants into our organisation? How can we grow as a BA function from that? But then there are what I like to call shadow BAs. And I bet some of you in your organisations have shadow BAs. These are people who are doing analysis, but they probably don't know that they're doing it. And there's one approach, probably quite a traditional approach, is to say, no, we don't want shadow BAs. This is ours. It's all ours. You can't do analysis unless you're a BA, and that's one approach. But another approach is to say, actually, let's shine the light on the shadows and let's throw them some love and bring them inside our community. Because we probably can't stop them doing it, but we might be able to give them some standards and some help and actually help us scale. So again, it's a collaborative intersection. Finally, probably in the UK, the biggest substitute for proper business analysis we see is what I call vendor and JDI. And that's when an executive has fallen in love with a solution. One organisation I used to work with, we had this joke, whenever the exec team went on a long haul flight, they used to come back and they'd have a new crazy idea. And we used to joke that we reckon they read the in-flight magazine and they just choose the technology that has the flashiest ad. So if you're a tool vendor, or if you're a vendor, advertising in-flight magazines, you're going to make a load of money. So vendor and JDI is another substitute. So it's worth us thinking about this collaborative landscape. How can we compete, or who do we compete with? How do we collaborate with them? How can we bring these people in? In doing this, we'll start to think about how to break through that brick wall. But what I was very keen to do is talk about how we do that. And I'm going to share with you now some techniques, some from the world of sales, some from analysis. This will be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I'll bring it together at the end. And if you want to know more, just grab me. And before I do that, though, I want to come back to this whole idea of selling and what we mean by selling. And I can still remember when I bought my first used car. And I suspect many of us can remember when we went to buy our first car. You know, you've just passed your driving test, it's really exciting. And I went to a used car dealership near where I live on the south coast of the UK, and it's a place called South Sea Motor Company. And I rocked up, and you know, I'm in my early 20s or whatever, and I rock up and I go to the little sales office, and the salesperson greets me really warmly, he's really excited to see me, and he asks, "What's your budget?" And I tell him my budget, and he's a lot less excited. You know what it's like buying your first car, right? And anyway, he's constantly trying to get me to try cars that are slightly above my budget. And he's trying to get me to fall in love with all these really luxurious cars. But I'm saying, no, I want something basic. I've just passed my test. In the UK, insurance is really expensive when you've just passed your test. And anyway, eventually we went out on a test drive with a sensible car, a little Ford Fiesta, and he was trying to close the sale. And we got back to the dealership, and he said, "Well, do you want to buy the car?" We had a negotiation over price, and he did that typical charade where he went into the office and said, "I've got to ring my manager to see if I can drop the price." And he rang his manager, and he said, "Yeah, we can do it for that price." And I just wasn't sure, so I said, "Okay, got a couple more cars to see. Are you open tomorrow?" His face dropped, right? He snatched the keys out of my hand, basically stropped back to the office and said, "If you're not interested in buying it right now, we're not interested in selling it to you." Now it's interesting, isn't it? You can't always remember exactly what people say, but you can sure as hell remember how they made you feel. And anyway, once I picked myself up off the ground, I kind of said, "Well, actually, I don't want to buy from you anymore. Thank you very much." Because we always say thank you very much in Britain, you know, it's a politeness thing. It's kind of funny, that and apologise and stand in line, that's what we're sort of famous for. But the point is, what that salesperson was doing is the bad sell. He was almost competing with me. It's like I told him what I needed, he tried to sell me something different. But it is so short term, because I will never ever go to that car dealership again. And I kind of tell that story. You know, and I remember that story for all the wrong reasons. But he was thinking about his needs, not mine. You know, not once did he ask, "What kind of mileage do you do? You know, do you need, how much luggage do you carry?" He didn't worry about my requirements, it was just his commission or whatever. But what I'm talking about is definitely not that. I'm talking about the good sell, a more collaborative approach where we build influence, we build credibility through consistent delivery of co-created value, and we build long-term relationships with the people that really matter to us, matter to our customers, and matter to our business. And this is about understanding the needs of all parties, including ourselves, and making sure those are met. So I've got a bit of a model that I'm going to talk you through, and we'll talk through like each stop on the roadmap, as it were. And that's this model. And if you've ever done sales, some of these terms will be familiar to you, but they were very unfamiliar to me when I started to research this. The first thing we're going to look at in just a second is monitoring the analysis landscape. I won't talk too much on that, that's very much around the 5 forces, but I'll bring that up again in a second. That helps us understand who we're competing with, how we can build those collaborative intersections to help co-create that value. But then there's this idea of a sales funnel, which I found really interesting when I started to speak to people who work in sales. Because if you work in sales, it's like sales 101. You need to understand your funnel. But we have like a change funnel. And I think so often as BAs, we're catching stuff at the bottom. But if we can work our way up the funnel, we can start to manage the funnel before it manages us. Then we'll talk about creating a proposal. And if you're selling in an external world, you have to propose something to a client. But even if we're internal, you know, we ultimately have to propose why we should work on that project. So we'll talk about crafting a message very briefly, and then finally we'll talk about delivering. The really nice thing about this is if we do it right, if we deliver well, it becomes a self-reinforcing feedback loop. We do it well so people want to work with us, so we get that opportunity. So we'll talk through these step by step. Firstly, monitoring the analysis landscape. This is where it's worth us thinking about our Porter's 5 forces. And how many people, show of hands, how many people here work in a team of business analysts? There's more than just you. Okay, so I'd say that's probably 90% of us. One thing you might want to do is, like, if you have a team meetings or like community of practice meetings, this could be a really fun exercise to do. To say who are people using instead of us? How could we collaborate with those people and think about those collaborative intersections? If you do that, my personal reflection and recommendation would be revisit it often, because the landscape changes. But it creates some really cool conversations. So a useful technique. But then we'll move on and we'll talk about managing the funnel. And when I think about the funnel, this is sort of the image that typically comes to mind, which is as BAs, we're sort of, it's like there's this executive team at the top that are having all these conversations, and they're thinking about change, and that gets thrown into a big change funnel. And then as BAs at the end, we're like trying to catch all the projects. Has anyone ever felt like that? Yeah. But if we can manage that funnel, if we can nudge it, help, then maybe we can manage the funnel rather than it managing us. And an interesting thing about the world of sales, when I started speaking to people who do selling for a living, professional salespeople, is they talked about sales funnel management. And they talked about different categories. And they said that, well, actually, if you're selling, someone starts out as a suspect. There's someone that you think could use your product or service, but they don't know about you yet. And you need to find a way of getting through to them. And I bet if you're in a large organisation, there are people in your organisation that aren't yet using BAs that could. And they're a really interesting area to target. You know, go out for coffee with them, try and explain to them what a business analyst is. And that's not to say that we'll get an assignment out of that immediately, but we start to plant the seed. Then, as we have those coffee morning conversations, they become a prospect. We know about them, they know about us, they know what we do. If there's a piece of analysis work, we'll probably have the opportunity to talk to them about it. And with some more of those coffee morning conversations, and I don't know about you, but I think as BAs we have quite attuned analysis antennae. And sometimes you're having a conversation with someone and you feel your antennae twitch. I've just realised that sounds a bit euphemistic. It's not meant in any kind of cheeky British way at all. Our antennas twitch. And so we might be having a conversation and they say, oh, we've got this process problem. And you think, okay, there's a project there. Or they say, yeah, we've got a vendor coming. And you think, risk. And that's where we can start to actually say, okay, well, here's there's an opportunity here that we can maybe help you with, and we can lighten the load for you. We can de-risk that vendor engagement by helping you know that the thing you're going to buy is right, and that'll probably escalate the project, and then you'll achieve your objectives, and you'll be the sponsor that everyone wants to work with. You know, can we come in? And who's going to say no to that? And finally, then we get the opportunity for them to become a client. I think I almost feel like I'm breaking a secret BA code by saying this. But it's like, I think the reality is, I don't think people really want BAs or analysis. What they want is delivered change. And if we can link everything we do to delivered change, they'll want to work with us time and time again. So finding those opportunities is really, really key. But there's the question of who do we convince? Which suspects do we need to convince? And it's easy to think it's just the sponsor. A technique that I'll show you very briefly is a technique called UCOB, which stands for User, Customer, Owner, Beneficiary. The user is the person who uses an end product. A customer or economic customer is the person who pays. The owner is the person who owns and maintains it. The beneficiary is the person or people that ultimately benefit. So to take a random example, like imagine a chain of hospitals buying pieces of hospital equipment. They're going to buy 10 scanners or something. Well, the economic buyer, the customer, is probably someone in a procurement team somewhere, and they want low capital cost. The user is probably a doctor, and they want it to be reliable and easy to use. The owner is probably the individual hospital who's going to maintain it, and they care about the maintenance cost. And the beneficiary is the poor patient that's being prodded by the machine, and they want it to be as pain-free as possible. So if we think about the different perspectives, we can create a really compelling sales pitch. And if you think about UCOB for business analysis, well, who uses our artifacts? Who uses our user stories, our requirements, our data models? Well, often it's testers, and developers. And the really interesting thing is often testers, developers can help amplify our message. Most testers and developers know if you've had a good BA, the project is better. They can help advocate what we do. Think about beneficiaries, actual end users, departments that end up owning the stuff we deliver. Again, they often know if you've got a good BA, it's better. They can become our advocate. So of course we should definitely get at the economic customer, but it's worth getting people to sell what we do alongside us. Good testers working with good BAs, working with good project managers, you end up with that dynamic trio or dynamic duo or whatever to really co-create that value. So we can think about UCOB for analysis. Again, another fun exercise to do in a group situation with your own teams. As we do that, we start to think about crafting a proposal. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because often when we speak to our stakeholders, they're talking very much about, we want to get away from something. And it's scary and it's horrible and it's cloudy, but there's something we want to get to, and it's all sunny and wonderful, and there's a silver bullet. There's normally a solution to get there, which is something we have to dodge as well. But in thinking about crafting a proposal that people are going to say yes to, we have to understand the situation that they find themselves in. And this requires our curiosity, our empathy, and our challenge. Because sometimes our stakeholders are politically exposed. They've made a commitment, and we might think there's a really great way of doing it, but we need to know the constraints they're under. To give you a real-life example of this picture was taken probably a year or 18 months ago in Portsmouth City Council Town Hall. The gentleman standing there is a gentleman called Councillor Ken Elcombe. And in the UK we have a system of local government as well as national government, and he was the head of traffic and transportation, the elected member for traffic and transportation. Now, Councillor Elcombe made a decision overnight without consulting any residents to change the way parking worked for about 10% of the city, which meant that residents couldn't park outside their own houses. Pretty much. I mean, that was essentially there was a residents' parking scheme, and he dissolved it. And it was considered so serious, it was brought in for review. And I was one of the residents that was affected. And I think, as most BAs, I wanted to have my say. And you can go to the town hall and you can make what's called a deputation. They give you 6 minutes to make your point. And I thought, oh, this is great. I'm an analyst. I can bring loads of facts. So I came with facts. I showed him why it wouldn't work. I showed him the impact of what he was doing, and I thought I did a really good job. I was really quite proud. I got a round of applause from the people in the public gallery, which I wasn't expecting. And then the vote came, and I thought, great, this is where it's going to change. And they all voted on party lines, and it stood. And it's still that way now. And I did what most British people would do in that situation. I was with some of my neighbours, and we walked to the nearest pub. and literally walking, but this is ironic, on the way walking to the pub, there was a piece of like garbage on the ground, and I picked it up, it got my attention. And it was a leaflet from this gentleman's political party. And what it said in there, it included the line about this parking decision, that it's in the group's election manifesto, it appeared in the core manifesto leaflet, we intend to deliver on that commitment. So he was politically exposed. There was no way they could overturn that decision because they committed to it. And I'd made that critical mistake that I think we often make as BAs, which is I went with loads of facts, and I wanted to almost prove him wrong. But there's that old expression, facts tell, stories sell. And I probably should have created a situation which would have let him back down, but be seen to delivering this objective. And I didn't, and it didn't change. But the point being that often if our stakeholders made a commitment to the market to deliver something by next month, well, if we say it's going to take a year, they're just going to close us out. If that's a real constraint, let's find out what we can do. We might not be able to do them everything, but let's find out what we can do so that they choose us over others. It's also really important that we tailor our approach. And I think we're all guilty of this. I know I am. I have techniques that are my favourites. I tend to gravitate towards them. But there can be a danger that we fall into like the analysis factory trap, where we just use the same techniques time and time again. And actually there's such a diverse toolbox. When we're thinking about the proposal, the way to get that stakeholder their outcome, let's go back to resources like the BA BOK and others and think about how we can really achieve that. So thinking about crafting the message so we create a compelling proposal so that they can say yes to, giving them something to say yes to. Well, another technique from the world of sales that again is sort of sales 101 is this idea of features and benefits. You have to know the features, but you sell the benefits. No one buys a feature, they buy an outcome. And the best example of this, do you remember when the iPod, the first iPod came out? Yeah. So there was another MP3 player at the time, and I forget what it was called. It was something like the Creative Zoom, I think. Yeah, something like that. And if you look at the adverts for that, the commercials for that other model, it had like, 5 gigabytes of memory, 21,000 milliamp hour battery, 3.5 mil jack. And Apple went to market with one clear message, which was 1,000 songs in your pocket. Yeah, 1,000 songs in your pocket, that's the benefit. 5 gigabytes of RAM, that's the feature. And people buy the benefits. So as BAs, I think if we talk about the benefits, we'll get those conversations. So you can create, again, from the world of sales, a features and benefits table. And here's just an example. But rather than talking about upfront pre-project problem analysis, how cool would it be if we turned that conversation around and talked about de-risking the whole project by ensuring that we do the right thing, by saving money? Which sponsor's going to say no to that? Rather than talking about feasibility, if we talked about helping you pick the winners and make informed decisions, we can really start to speak their language. So it's important that we know the features while selling the benefits. Alongside that, telling stories of how things have succeeded, how they've worked, how we can help even more. I know I've said this once already, but I truly believe it. Facts tell, stories sell. And I think as BAs, we're wired to think in facts, but if we can rewire ourselves to talk in stories, we will gain even more traction for the awesome stuff that we can do. Finally, we need to deliver and anticipate future needs. Credibility comes through delivery. And there's an old Henry Ford quote that you can't build a reputation on what you are going to do. So we need to make sure, if we're proposing to do something, that we can actually do it. But then as we do that, They come back to us. We're their first port of call for any kind of strategic change. We build business analysis into the very fibre of our organisation's being. And in doing so, we brick by brick by brick break through that wall of misunderstanding. We do it in our organisations, we do it as communities, we do it as communities of practice together. So we've talked about monitoring the analysis landscape with our 5 forces, thinking about who we can collaborate, those collaborative intersections. We've talked about managing the pipeline from suspect, prospect, and so on. We talked about creating a really compelling proposal, giving someone something to say yes to, and we talked about delivering and anticipating future need. Now, one question you might have in your mind right now, just before I close for just a couple of questions, is do we need to shout about our successes? And we definitely do. So 2 things I would add to this, which I haven't had the chance to talk about today, is I think we have to really promote what we do. We have to continually develop our practice. But finally, you might be thinking, how do we find the time? Because we're already busy. But if you think about it, if we've got better engagement, if the pipeline isn't managing us, it frees up time. If we're not chasing those silver line solution illusion bullets, we have more time, and we can build this into our own routines as a team and as a community. Final ponder point. Imagine the fire control project. Imagine if there were really BAs banging on that brick wall. Imagine if they got through. How could that project have ended differently? And what can we do to help ensure that our projects are successful? And with that, I will thank you.